Carter clicked the projector on before my chair even stopped spinning. "Let's talk vision," he said, striding across the boardroom like he hadn't just buried the man who built everything he was about to burn down. 2 days since the funeral, and the scent of Dad's cologne still lingered in the hallway. I hadn't even cleaned out his office yet. Carter didn't care. The seat wasn't cold before he filled it with his swagger and buzzwords. "We're phasing out manual processes, no more spreadsheets. Real-time AI dashboards, predictive cash flow logic. We're modernizing." He turned to me like I was a burnt-out bulb he was tired of flicking. "We don't need your massaging anymore. It's 2025. I didn't say a word. Just closed my laptop, slid my pen back into the sleeve, and stared at the table where Dad used to sit, hands steepled, watching both of us like he was waiting for one to outgrow the other. He always said, "Balance sheets are stories, not numbers. Read them out loud and they'll tell you where the rot starts." Carter never listened to that. He wanted numbers that danced. I gave him numbers that warned. There's a difference. But sure, let the app do it now. Hey, real quick before we dive deeper. If you're listening and getting into the story, take 2 seconds to tap that like button and subscribe. I know 97% of you don't, but it really keeps this kind of storytelling alive and means a ton to the team behind it. All right, back to it. So I let them roll with their new era. Watched Carter swipe through slides like a kid showing off summer camp photos. He had no clue what half the ratios meant, but he sure loved the colors. The board nodded along, mostly Dad's old golf buddies and a few of Carter's college pals he slid in through backdoor titles like Innovation Advisor. I didn't belong anymore, not in this version. That night, while Carter and his inner circle popped champagne in the executive lounge, yes, they actually did that, I walked into my old office, turned the desk lamp on, and ran my hand along the edge of Dad's ledger. The last one we'd done together, 4 days before he collapsed in his garden. "One more month," he whispered, pointing at a line item. "If we get to October without Carter crashing the margin buffer, I'll put the contingency trust in your name." He didn't make it to October, and I never saw that trust. Instead, I watched Carter blow through Dad's monthly cash flow models like they were junk mail, ignored the staggered supplier calendar, stripped out my 5-year macro overlay. When I reminded him about it, calmly, quietly, because I knew how this game worked, he smirked and said, "We've got an app for that now." So I left. Didn't even wait for a formal announcement. Just backed up my models, encrypted the archives, and walked down the hall with a small cardboard box that held exactly what they thought of me. One empty coffee mug and a desk plant I forgot to water. Carter didn't notice I was gone. Not that week, not the next. But the system noticed. By the following month, their treasury schedule missed its first internal deadline in 11 years. Suppliers went from net 45 to net 15. Float disappeared. And the first overdraft fee since 2014 appeared on the statement like a hairline crack in a dam. They thought I was a spreadsheet jockey. What they forgot was this. I wasn't holding numbers. I was holding the center. And when you dismiss the only one who knows where the quiet hinges are, the door doesn't slam shut. It falls off the frame. I didn't slam any doors. That's not how the system was built. I walked out the way I walked in a decade ago, quietly, with everything they didn't know they'd need still running through my fingers. On the surface, it looked like I was just one more relic stepping aside for progress. But in the background, I was taking every stitch of thread they'd mistaken for decoration. All the formulas, all the custom flags, all the conditional triggers that whispered when cash flow dipped below a line no app even knew existed. All mine. I moved the files, every last protected workbook, every notes tab, every obscure macro data I had stitched together at 2 a.m. over cold takeout into a secure private archive, labeled cleanly, dated, digitally notarized. And then I went into the system and removed my permissions, not just access, authorship. They wouldn't even know what broke, only that the ghost in the machine had stopped humming. The message I left for accounts was 3 words longer than they deserved. Call me if it collapses. No smiley face, no signature. I knew Lisa in AR would understand. She was the only one who ever asked me why I staggered vendor payments instead of just how. She'd feel it first when the float ran dry. I handed my badge to the front desk. The CFO didn't look up. Carter? Probably thought I was in a meeting when he passed me in the elevator. Good. Let him think that. That night, I went home, poured 2 fingers of bourbon into Dad's old glass, and opened the red folder he'd marked for when I'm gone. Inside wasn't a letter or a list of assets or even a goodbye, just one line in his tight handwriting taped to a printout of the shareholder agreement. If removed without cause, financial models revert to private property. He had buried it in an amendment filed during the 2016 restructure, nestled between boring legal language about digital IP rights and procedural bypasses in the event of emergency. Typical Dad. Hide the knife inside the fine print, just in case you ever needed it to cut your way out. I remember reviewing the draft with him back then. I asked, "Is this overkill?" He didn't answer, just circled the clause and said, "One day they'll forget why this was needed. You won't." He was right. The next morning, I emailed myself a receipt of ownership for the last full financial model synced to the live treasury system. Dated 2 days before Dad died. It was the only version with every floating clause, every conditional delay, every buffer trick they never taught at Wharton. By legal definition, without my active consent or cause for termination, it was mine. They could slap together a dashboard, hire a firm to build a plugin, but they'd never recreate the thing that made it work, the judgment baked into every cell. The pauses, the weighted averages based on vendor trust cycles, the risk triggers I tied to weather data, because Dad swore heavy snow meant slowed payments in Q1. You don't rebuild that with AI. You don't even know to look for it. I didn't post a goodbye on LinkedIn. I didn't write a blog about legacy or leadership or loss. I just walked out, drove home, and slept 10 hours straight for the first time since the funeral. When I woke up, I felt it. Not relief, not revenge, just stillness, like the kind that settles in after a long storm, the kind that makes you realize you're not the past. You're the blueprint they never learned to read. The attic had sloped ceilings, a cracked window, and insulation that wheezed when the wind turned. But for 10 years, it was my war room. From up there, I ran silent math across a battlefield no one noticed, where cash flow was the only air supply, and I kept everyone breathing without making a sound. But after the funeral and the boardroom parade of buzzwords that followed, the attic felt too small, too polite, like staying there would make me complicit in their delusion that I'd faded out quietly. I hadn't. I'd just stepped off the stage while the lights were still warm, so I moved. Nothing flashy. A 3-room unit above a bakery, old wiring, fresh paint, a door that locked from the inside. I put a nameplate on it that didn't bear my last name, just the initials, TBC. My father would have smiled at that. The balance continues. He always hated titles that tried too hard. I didn't post about the move. No filtered desk photos, no new chapter begins in caption. Just unpacked my secondhand filing cabinet, reconnected my backup server, and brewed the first pot of coffee in a space that was mine. Then I picked up the phone. I didn't call clients. I called relationships. People I'd helped quietly over the years, when their cash cycles twisted, when their reports didn't reconcile, when their loan covenants got tight and they needed a cleaner story to tell the bank. Folks who knew I didn't advertise, didn't chase, didn't inflate. "Hey," I said, same tone as always. "Just letting you know I'm working solo now. If things ever get lumpy on your books, you know how to find me." They did. 2 meetings booked by noon, no resumes exchanged, just trust built off a decade of small, correct moves. And while I didn't say a word to anyone still inside my father's company, the wind carried stories faster than email. By week 3, their monthly liquidity report hadn't posted. I knew because Lisa from accounts called, not to beg, just to confirm. "We submitted the inputs," she said, "but it's like the system doesn't know what to do with them anymore." I asked if Carter noticed. She laughed bitterly. "He thinks the AI is just rebalancing things, told us not to interfere with the logic." Right. By week 4, a routine line of credit review got flagged by their primary lender. A small ratio, insignificant on paper, but enough to trigger a formal look. The kind of thing that never happened when I was running the timing behind the curtain. They'd remove the buffer I used to hide behind low invoice months. They let it expire, thinking the system would self-correct. It didn't, because I was the system. The spreadsheet wasn't just a file. It was a memory palace, a living map of how cash actually moved, when to expect resistance, when to brace, when to breathe. Without it, the app treated revenue like water in a pipe. It wasn't. It was fog, moving with pressure, heat, and hesitation, something you could only predict if you lived inside it. And now that they'd sealed that door shut, they were left standing in the mist. Meanwhile, I rebuilt slowly, signed a retainer with a regional bank whose treasury head I used to tutor in grad school, took a seat on the audit review board for a mid-sized logistics firm that had survived the pandemic because I'd quietly restructured their receivables cadence in 2020. Set up a weekly call with a founder who used to ignore my advice, until he didn't, and it saved him a warehouse's worth of stock. All quiet, all clean, all unfolding the way Dad used to say real business should, not with noise, but with momentum. I watched the emails trickle in from my old company, subject lines like urgent, treasury delay, and vendor terms, unexpected change. All left unread, all exactly as I expected. Time was doing what I couldn't say out loud, teaching Carter a lesson I'd spent 10 years preparing him to avoid. But some people don't learn until the cracks reach the ceiling, and some ceilings only fall after the scaffolding walks away. The first sign was a 3-line email from Treasury with the subject line, "Mismatch detected, payment schedule drift." I'd seen that phrase before. Wrote it myself, in fact, years ago as a conditional flag buried deep inside the old vendor cadence sheet. It was meant to trigger when the payment release logic no longer aligned with the term stagger, usually a sign that someone had fiddled with the delay mechanism or pushed something manually without understanding why it was weighted that way in the first place. I knew exactly what it meant, but Carter didn't. "Just sync the API again," he replied. According to someone still inside who forwarded the thread to me anonymously with the note, "Can't tell if he's clueless or confident. Probably both." The thing is, syncing an API to raw inputs without applying the nuanced float logic behind the scenes is like pointing a fire hose at a bonsai tree. Sure, it delivers water, but it kills everything you were trying to grow. By the end of that week, the first overdraft fee appeared. Just a small one, but enough to show the liquidity pool wasn't breathing properly. When I was managing it, cash flow moved like a set of lungs, expanding and contracting with predictable rhythm. I built cushions for vendor variances, forecasted soft receivables against rainy day buffers, even tied disbursement delays to weather data from key shipping hubs. Dad's idea said snow in Cincinnati always meant payment delays in Cleveland. But none of that made it into the app Carter loved so much. By week 2, vendors started adjusting their terms, slowly, quietly. Net 30 moved to net 15. Some went cowdy without warning. It was a cascade. One vendor sees the late ACH, the others follow suit. Like watching dominoes tip in reverse. Not a collapse yet, but the pressure was shifting. And Carter, in his glass corner office with his color-coded dashboards, was still telling the team to let the logic sort itself out. The logic didn't care. The logic wasn't me. Then the bank called. A scheduled check-in became an unscheduled review. Their risk team flagged the company's liquidity position as in flux. Someone from their exposure division placed a formal request for updated modeling inputs. Except there were none. Because the app didn't model. It reflected. It parroted back raw numbers and guessed at rhythm based on historical lag. But it didn't adjust for nuance, didn't compensate for shifting vendor trust, didn't know that certain clients always paid 2 days after the third invoice reminder, not because of capacity, but because of an internal policy no algorithm could ever intuit. The models I built accounted for all of that. My little spreadsheets, as Carter once called them, were 80% observation, 20% math. Scaffolding. Invisible until you pull it out and watch the structure begin to sag. Inside, things were getting loud. I heard from Lisa again, her emails shorter this time. "They're panicking," she wrote. "Carter keeps telling us the system's just out of sync and that AI will learn our payment patterns. Meanwhile, vendors are threatening to pause shipments. And the CFO, he started coming in at 6 a.m. and leaving after 9. That never happens." I didn't reply. I didn't need to, because when scaffolding fails, it's not the flash of collapse that kills first. It's the sound. The creaking, the subtle, undeniable shift in weight, the silence that follows when people start realizing no one understands what they're standing on. By the time Carter noticed, the vendors had already sent revised terms. The treasury system was running with delays it couldn't explain. and the bank had quietly downgraded their credit rating internally at first. The call about revisiting your exposure was just a formality. They knew. They didn't know what they knew, but they felt it. A system designed around confidence had started to sweat, and from a small, warm office above a bakery, I watched them try to fan the flames with dashboards that couldn't feel heat. They brought in legal when the wires got quiet. That's how you know panic has stopped being a hunch and turned into a strategy. Not strategy like planning, strategy like triage, the kind where people start whispering instead of replying all. Apparently, the CFO asked for a full back read of old models and treasury logs, looking for any sign, any reason why the system that used to hum had started to grind. Legal pulled archived files from cold storage, workbooks they hadn't touched in years, models saved under names like FY19 RevC Final V7 ForReal.SLSX that nobody had opened since the last time the margin buffer flirted with danger. And somewhere in that digital graveyard, a junior accountant named Jamie found it. A single cell note buried 3 tabs deep in a workbook dated March 2018. Trigger float release only if days cash on hand 38, she flagged it. Slapped a red comment bubble on it. Sent it up the chain with a confused Slack message. Is this a typo or a setting in the new system? It wasn't either. It was a judgment call, mine. A rule I'd built off a 5-year average, observing when float could be safely released without risking the vendor cascade. Not something any system could have guessed. I didn't publish that logic, didn't brag about it, I just baked it into the model like muscle memory, because that's what cash flow modeling is when done right. It's not coding, it's instinct formalized. But to Jamie, it looked like nonsense. To Carter, it looked like a threat. He called the software vendor in a sweat, voice tight. Hey, just checking. Where would I find the float trigger logic in the system? You know, the buffer management? They paused. Then came the answer. That logic isn't in the system. Must have been manually handled. By someone else. By someone else. That's when it landed. Not softly. Not slowly. It landed. Because Carter, for all his ego, wasn't stupid. Arrogant? Yes. Ignorant? Absolutely. But even he knew what that meant. He'd replace something he didn't understand with something he couldn't control. And now they were seeing the difference. The app could report data, but it didn't understand the terrain. It couldn't feel when a vendor was about to pull terms, or when a client was circling the drain, or when Treasury needed a soft delay disguised as a procedural holiday batch review. It couldn't tell them that day 38 was the soft floor below which the dominoes began to tip. I did. Every single time. But they buried that knowledge under dashboards and buzzwords, never realizing the system wasn't broken now. It was working exactly as they'd built it, without me. Inside, the stories started shifting. Lisa told me that the CFO had started poking into old Slack channels, trying to find messages I'd left. Carter was pulling up meeting recordings from the past 3 years, searching for keywords like float logic, buffer hold, treasury override. They were dissecting every breadcrumb I'd never meant to leave, looking for the map they'd tossed out the window the moment I turned in my badge, and all they found were fragments. Because I didn't teach the models, I was the model. A living buffer between chaos and collapse, smoothing the path just enough that they thought the road was flat. Now, the bumps were back, the wheels were shaking, and the driver was gripping the wheel, realizing too late that the brakes weren't where he thought they'd be. You can't replicate judgment with code, not the kind that comes from a decade of sitting quietly in the dark, listening to how numbers breathe, watching cash flow like it was weather, anticipating storms before they had names. You can't teach that. You either learn it slowly, painfully, one cycle at a time, or you lose it all at once. They chose the second path. And now they were standing in the rubble, wondering why the blueprints made no sense. They scheduled the quarterly covenant review like it was any other meeting. No urgency in the calendar invite. Just Q4 liquidity status review, boardroom C, 11 a.m. As if it were still business as usual, as if the vendors weren't circling like sharks, and the treasury team wasn't quietly dusting off their resumes. But the bank knew. They always know before anyone else. You can bluff a board. You can delay a vendor. But the people holding your leverage don't blink when the math shifts. They watch. And when your burn rate climbs out of rhythm with your intake pattern, they don't send flowers. They send risk officers. So when Carter strolled into boardroom C that morning in his tailored navy suit and tech bro grin, he thought he was walking into a quarterly formality, a checkbox. Instead, he met Daniel Shaw, lead risk officer, Midwestern Lending Division, a man with a face like an IRS audit and a memory like a ledger. Daniel didn't bother with pleasantries. He sat down, folded his hands, and let Carter dig his own grave for the first 15 minutes. Carter pulled up the real-time dashboard on the big screen. Color-coded trends, burn rate heat maps, some predictive tool with a beta tag still in the corner. He spun it all like a pitch. As you can see, we've integrated AI forecasting into our treasury flow, allowing for dynamic liquidity response. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Your burn rate's up 19% quarter over quarter. Vendor credits down 32% in the same window. Float coverage has dropped below threshold for 3 consecutive weeks. Carter blinked, then grinned, too wide, the way someone does when they realize they're about to get humbled, but think maybe a little charm might save them. Well, that's part of the recalibration we're seeing with the new system. AI takes time to adjust to the seasonality, but the dashboards give us real time. Daniel cut him off. No malice, just math. Where is the only person who ever understood your cash flow? Silence. Not confusion, not offense, just silence. Because Carter knew exactly who he meant. And he knew I wasn't on his payroll anymore. He just didn't know where I had gone. So he stammered something about legacy systems and overly manual processes, then offered a half-choked sentence about how the company was transitioning away from human-dependent forecasting. Daniel didn't blink, didn't look at the screen. He opened a thin navy folder with a single sheet inside, slid it across the table like a closing argument. You should know, he said, adjusting his cuff. She's on our advisory board now. Every head turned. Daniel continued, voice calm, almost bored. She's helping us refine our liquidity risk models. Very precise work. We found her insights. Predictive. The room was dead quiet. Even the CFO, normally a statue in these meetings, dropped his pen. Carter leaned back slightly, eyes flicking toward the dashboard like it might suddenly offer him an exit strategy. It didn't. Because dashboards don't speak. They don't negotiate. They don't whisper truths in the middle of fiscal storms. People do, and the person who used to do that for them now sat on the other side of the table. Indirectly, but completely. Not as their analyst, as the bank's. I wasn't the backup anymore. I was the gatekeeper. Daniel closed the folder. We'll be reviewing your line of credit terms. Expect revisions. No yelling, no scolding, just a simple pivot, a transfer of gravity. And for the first time in his career, Carter looked like he understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of quiet power. You can't outrun it, because when it shows up, it doesn't knock. It opens the door you forgot to lock and sits at the table you assumed was yours. The freeze hit like black ice, sudden, silent, and with just enough plausible deniability to let Carter think he could still steer. The email came in at 7:03 a.m. from the bank's Treasury Oversight Division. As of today, the existing credit line will be suspended pending review of risk exposure and revised modeling compliance. No emotion, just fact. By 9:30, the payroll system had hiccuped. Funds were queued, then held. Direct deposit confirmations that usually pinged without a blink started bouncing with red error flags. Mid-tier managers were already texting their department heads, trying to soften the blow before rumors got out. But rumors are faster than leadership. By noon, a client I'd worked with for 8 years, one who'd been steady through 2 market downturns, called Carter's team to request an adjusted payment schedule. Net 60, effective immediately. When they didn't get an answer fast enough, they sent another email. Given the current liquidity uncertainty, we're reevaluating our exposure. That was the moment it stopped being internal. Once clients feel the quake, the market reacts. You can't AI your way out of that. Carter called me twice. First time, no voicemail. Just a missed call with his name lighting up my screen like a fire I'd already walked away from. Second time, he left a message. The voice was cracked glass, not broken, splintering. Look, we need to talk. I think maybe we got ahead of ourselves. I just want to understand what you were doing, okay? Can we meet? I didn't reply. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee, opened the back window of my small office, and listened to the low hum of city life below. Across the street, the bakery was stacking loaves in the window. Normal continued, whether Carter understood it or not. The CFO reached out 2 days later. His message was longer, quieter, less bravado, just exhaustion threaded through an apology. "We didn't know," he wrote. "We're sorry." I read it twice before replying. Not because I needed to think, I already knew what to say, but because part of me wanted to feel something: anger, vindication, triumph. Instead, I felt still. My reply was one sentence. That was the point. They weren't supposed to know. That was the whole design. My spreadsheets weren't protection from collapse. They were protection against the people who'd one day assume they couldn't collapse. Carter thought the scaffolding was holding me up. He never realized I was the scaffolding. And now? Now he stood in the hollowed-out shell of a system too proud to admit it had never understood itself. Numbers moved, yes, but the meaning was gone. The rhythm, the breath, the human hand that had quietly bent volatility into margin buffers, gone. Payroll recovered 3 days later after a temporary bridge loan was negotiated at higher interest. Clients restructured terms. Internal panic was reframed as adaptive forecasting challenges. Carter went silent on social media. The AI dashboard firm quietly pulled their logo off the case study. And me? I took on 2 new clients. Both had heard about what happened somewhere else. And both asked me the same question at the end of our first meeting. Can you make sure we don't fall into the same trap? I said yes. Not because I was eager to fix more messes, but because there's something clean about building again from scratch, especially when the last house collapsed exactly the way you warned it would. The offer came wrapped in desperation and embossed letterhead. An emergency board session had been called after the bridge loan's terms were released: high interest, tight reporting requirements, and a 90-day sunset clause unless substantive structural adjustments were implemented. I wasn't in the room, of course, but I knew the language. It was bankers speak for, "You're being watched. Fix this or we walk." So the board reached out. Not Carter. He was strangely absent from the communication, his name never mentioned, as if omitting it might help rebuild credibility by proximity alone. The message came from the chairwoman herself. Neutral tone, punctuated sentences. Legal copied in BCC, they offered a consulting role. Said it could be high visibility with full creative control, and even floated the idea of a public acknowledgement. To repair shareholder trust, they phrased it. Legacy credit line reinstated. Soft reset. Clean slate. I read the proposal 3 times, then closed the file, and wrote my own. No emotion, no commentary, just a 4-page term sheet on firm letterhead. My new firm's, not mine, ours. I'd brought in 2 junior analysts, both former interns who used to shadow me on vendor calls and ask the right kind of questions. Sharp kids, no ego, just hunger to understand why things moved the way they did. The term sheet was simple. My firm would acquire and assume full responsibility for treasury modeling and oversight. We would operate independently, reporting only to the board. All existing internal dashboards would be sunset within 60 days. All proprietary models would remain private property, licensed annually. Reinstatement of legacy credit lines would be contingent upon full operational autonomy. Carter would not be involved, in any capacity, they signed. Without edits, without delay. Because power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it slides across the table in a manila envelope. They didn't want a partner. They wanted a firewall, something to wedge between their burn rate and the next quarterly call with the bank. I didn't gloat, didn't smile. Just emailed the signed copy to our counsel, ordered a new whiteboard for the office, and called the bakery downstairs to confirm the standing breakfast order for Monday mornings would now be for 4. When Carter found out, hours later, according to someone who still forwarded me internal messages, he said nothing, didn't object, didn't even show up to the next board meeting. Some speculated he was taking time to recalibrate. Others whispered about a leave of absence. I didn't ask, didn't care. My name wasn't in the building anymore. But my logic was. Embedded, licensed, untouchable. It wasn't revenge. Revenge is emotional, chaotic, personal. This was math. Precise, measured, restorative. And from where I stood, above the bakery, fresh spreadsheet open, two junior analysts adjusting float projections in the background, it was exactly the kind of quiet correction Dad used to believe in. Not fire, just balance. Returned. The shareholder meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. sharp, but by 7:42 the lobby was already full of hushed voices and pinched expressions. People who hadn't attended a quarterly call in years were now standing in line to sign the attendance sheet. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about faith. Shaken, bruised, and suddenly curious about where the real weight in the company had ever lived. I didn't attend in person, wasn't required to. Our role was licensed, not employed, and I liked it that way. Detachment has a clarity salaried titles can't afford, but I had someone in the room. One of my juniors, Mila, sat quietly in the back with a notepad and a calm expression that came from knowing every number behind the curtain. She texted me at 8:17. Carter just walked in, looks exhausted. By 8:34, he's reading a prepared statement. No one's interrupting. By 8:39, it's done. He resigned. No applause, no gasps, just a pause. The CFO, gray hair, quiet eyes, a man who used to walk past me in the hallway without ever asking how payroll reconciliations actually worked, was named interim CEO by unanimous vote. Mila said he didn't look proud, just relieved. Like someone who had finally realized there's no dignity in pretending to understand a fire drill when your shoes are on fire. Then came the confirmation call from the bank. Daniel Shaw, voice calm as always, said, "Credit line is reinstated, effective immediately, subject to the terms outlined in your advisory contract." I thanked him. He added, after a pause, "The board asked us if we were confident in the new structure." I asked what he told them. He chuckled. I told them it wasn't new, it was restored. After that, the dashboards came down, quietly, without announcement. My team had already embedded the new models into their daily ops, same logic as before, only this time under contract, protected, and traceable. One of my analysts flagged the first recovered liquidity buffer on Thursday at 3:14 p.m., a quiet 1.2 annator window that shouldn't have existed, but did. It was margin created not by revenue but by timing, by rhythm, by knowing that 3 vendors would delay charges the same week a key client always prepaid early in Q2. A computer couldn't predict that, but I could. And now, so could my team. I opened the report, skimmed the numbers, double-checked the cadence. It was right, clean, alive. I logged off, sat back, closed my eyes. For a moment, I could almost hear Dad's voice behind me. Calm, dry. Proud in that way he never said, but always carried in his shoulders. "They called them little spreadsheets," I whispered, watching the sun slide across the wall. But they were the firewall, and they pulled the plug.